Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 578, The Kings of the Ring, part 5. One of the remarkable things I learned about Akebono's career as I researched more about his life was the extent to which his success owes very little, from what I've seen, to his ostensible instructor. Akebono spent his entire career at Azumaseki Beya, run by Takamiyama, like him a Hawaiian-American wrestler, someone who had scouted Akebono to come to Japan and compete. And yet, it's pretty clear the men just didn't get along. Akebono, from what I've read, honestly really seems to have hated Takamiyama and actively resented him for much of his career. Which is interesting, because I don't know about you, but that's more or less the exact opposite of what I expected going in. I mean, come on. Two people, same background, one older, one younger, the older one scouting the younger one to come to this new place on the other side of the earth to compete just like he had when he'd been younger. It's a cheesy sports movie that almost writes itself. You can almost hear the dialogue in the climactic final moment when they finally come to understand each other and bond over their shared experiences and their love of the game. Except that's not even close to what happened, for a few reasons. First, remember, initially Takamiyama didn't even want young Chad Rowan, the future Akebono. He wanted the younger brother, George Rowan, better known by his nickname Ola. Akebono was just a stepping stone, proof of concept to the Rowans that their younger son, who was shorter than Akebono but just as strong and had a less top-heavy build as a result that was better for sumo, could be entrusted to Azumaseki Beya. And Takamiyama did eventually get Ola Rowan, who would come to Japan in the summer of 1989, just after finishing high school, and inherit his brother's old shikona, Taikai, the Broad Ocean. But Ola Rowan would prove a disastrous candidate for sumo. What Takamiyama didn't know was that in terms of temperament, Ola Rowan was even less of a conventional rikishi than his older brother was. Unlike Chad Rowan, who is simply a typical American teenager with the usual disdain for following rules just because, Ola Rowan was an active lawbreaker. By high school, by his own later admission, he was involved in the drug trade, dealing crystal meth to his classmates, and getting arrested by the cops in Hawaii. Like his brother, he was a talented high school athlete, playing both baseball and American football, but consistently in trouble with his coaches for slacking off, lacking the drive, the discipline to compete. Once he made it to Japan, he made his Maezumo debut in September 1989, and did make a good showing of himself. But for his next tournament in November, when he would have actually started his climb up the Bansuke, Ola Rowan was a no-show, and I mean that literally. The tournament in November is in Fukuoka, in Kyushu, and Ola Rowan just didn't come. It later emerged that he had just wandered away from the other wrestlers in his beya to Shikoku in the company of some yakuza to go out drinking and gambling. When he found out, Takamiyama was so apoplectic with rage that he booted Ola Rowan out of Azumaseki Beya and sent the boy home literally the next day. Once back in Hawaii, Ola Rowan would return to a life of crime. The last report I could find was from 2011 when he was still in federal prison for drug trafficking. I have no idea what happened to him after that, other than that Hawaii's prisoner database lists George Rowan, who I think is the right one based on the associated dates, as no longer in custody. So hopefully things are going better. Maybe there's a universe where, realizing that Ola Rowan was a bust, Takamiyama would turn his attentions to Akebono, realize what he had, and actually try to build a real rapport with this young, talented rikishi. Again, classic sports movie stuff. You can also hear the speech at the end about realizing that dedication and work ethic are what really matter for success. But not so much. Even after Ola Rowan flamed out of the sumo world in spectacular fashion, I can't say for sure, but I'm pretty confident not many other rikishi have just failed to show up for their debut because they were on a different home island getting trashed with the yakuza. Takamiyama never really made that much time for Akebono. Even after Akebono made it to the top of the sumo world, their relationship was by all accounts pretty superficial. Takamiyama showed up in the role of the oyakata of a yokozuna, playing his part, performing chit-chat with his famous pupil, but their relationship was pure tatemae. If you haven't heard that term before, it means something like constructed face and refers to a very classically Japanese sociological construct. I think the first time I heard this word was in second year Japanese, to give you an idea of how basic it's considered to be. In essence, tatemae is the face you put up because you feel compelled or expected to do so around others. Your honne, your true feelings, are revealed only to those closest to you. Tatemae is one of those concepts that, at least in my experience, is intended to smooth over the inherent awkwardness of social interaction by giving everyone a clear script. In this scenario, you have this position, so you do this role in this way. For example, anyone who's studied Japanese knows the scenario where you speak any Japanese around a native speaker, which inevitably leads to the tatemae of their compliments. Oh, jouzu desu ne, you're very talented. You might have tripped over some words or said something lightly incoherent, but the tatemae demands recognizing the effort. Your job, meanwhile, is to be humble. Mada desu kedo, I still have a long way to go. And of course, this is not at all a uniquely Japanese concept. Despite what some who wax philosophical on the subject will say, being constrained by a rigid social script that tells you how to interact with others is a tale as old as society itself. But of course, in sumo in particular, tatemae has a lot of importance, particularly for high-level rikishi. Recall that quote from the wrestler Yamato, birth name George Kalima, about how George and Yamato were two different personas, two different roles he had to know when and how to alternate between. There's definitely a strict set of tatemae for yokozuna and oyakata who trains the yokozuna, and publicly Akebono and Takamiyama always played those roles. Privately, well, we don't really know what Takamiyama's honne, his true feelings towards Akebono, were. He never really spoke about any of that stuff. He'd really internalized this very traditional notion of what it meant to be an oyakata, and part of it was just not talking about private things with the press. Akebono was less shy. We know his honne towards Takamiyama, and I think the nicest thing you could say is that Akebono, well, maybe he didn't actually hate his oyakata, but he clearly did not like him. Even speaking with his biographer Mark Panic, Akebono didn't really credit Takamiyama with his rise to yokozuna, which is a bit odd. His main memories of boss were about the ways Takamiyama teased and discouraged him, about Takamiyama wavering on whether to even bother continue training Akebono during his first few months in Japan, when he was still trying to get things down. And by the way, that did happen. Takamiyama did almost give up on Akebono around the time of his Maezumo debut, convincing himself the boy was just too tall to ever succeed. It was only the intervention of his cousin, Larry Aweu, the Hawaiian talent scout, that convinced Takamiyama to allow the boy to stay. Akebono never said as much to Panic or anybody else, but the impression he gave off later in life was that he never really forgave his oyakata for not believing in him, for discouraging him. Did Takamiyama ever feel bad about that, regret it? We don't know. Again, not something he ever talked about publicly. There's one other side to their changing relationship, of course. After a certain point, Akebono, who would in fact become the first foreign-born yokozuna in Japanese history, was just more talented than Takamiyama, who had a solid but never legendary career in the same way, and who capped out 2 ranks lower than that at Sekiwake. This happens a fair amount in sumo, of course. It's not unheard of for an oyakata to train someone who makes it higher up the bansuke than they themselves did. One would hope, of course, for a teacher to be proud of their student in that instance, but you also have to imagine jealousy being an issue there, particularly if the relationship is already sour. But again, speculation, we don't actually know what Takamiyama felt. What I imagine a few of you are wondering, though, is if it isn't through the coaching of the guy who was, supposed to coach him, how did Akebono manage his rise? Well, there's a few people he credits. If you're wondering, Konishiki is one of them, though the two were, well, both friends and not. They were close enough that Konishiki did, for example, come to his stablemates' birthday parties and family events and whatnot when invited, but neither man, from their own recollections, was ever, tight with the other one. After all, they were in a real sense both competitors vying for promotion, and that makes a friendship hard to form. But Konishiki was always an inspiration, and for his part, the older wrestler really seems to have respected Akebono and his work ethic. Another inspiration was Chiyonofuji, the great yokozuna of the late 1980s, the pioneer of weight training in sumo, a man who, despite being just 5 foot 10 inches, or 179 centimeters, and 278 pounds, or 126 kilograms, could and had lifted the great Konishiki off his feet to throw him to the ground. Chiyonofuji was the guy of the late 1980s and early 1990s era of sumo. Seriously, the Lone Wolf, as he's sometimes nicknamed, is probably the single most famous rikishi in this narrative who we're just going to talk about tangentially. Easily worthy of his own episode if I ever just give up and turn this fully into a sumo fan podcast. Chiyonofuji, of course, I don't think really knew he helped Akebono. He retired in May 1991 and hadn't wrestled a full tournament by that point since November. When Akebono was still low enough on the Bansuke, he wouldn't even get matched with a yokozuna. But Akebono would later recall a joint practice between a few different stables where he saw Chiyonofuji in person, up close, and was impressed not just by the man's talent, his athleticism, but how he carried himself. It's hard to describe if you haven't seen a video of him, but Chiyonofuji just exuded this aura of charisma in his day. There's a reason he wasn't just a yokozuna, but almost like a national sex symbol in his time. It did help that he was a lot slimmer and more traditionally handsome than a lot of rikishi. And he embodied the hinkaku, the dignity of the yokozuna title. Akebono would talk about seeing Chiyonofuji put on his tsuna, the corded rope with paper strips that gives the rank its name, and being so impressed by the gravitas of the moment, the way the man in the rank just commanded respect. And of course, he talked about how from that moment on, he wanted those things for himself. Probably the person Akebono credited the most for his rise, though, was Bob Beveridge, the American military vet turned expat and sports fanatic whom he'd met at an Azumaseki Beya supporters party. Beveridge took it upon himself to coach the young kid in a way that Takamiyama never did, helping him with both strength training and technique, and inviting Akebono to a small gym he'd set up in Tokyo's Ebisu neighborhood to train frequently. As he later told it to Mark Panik, the advice Beveridge gave to Akebono was mostly about dealing with the boy's biggest disadvantage, his height. Being tall does give you reach, but it also raises your center of gravity, which makes it easier for someone who is smaller to get under your center of gravity and throw you down. But, Beveridge told Akebono, you can beat this by, quote, keeping your stance wide and keeping your ass down. If you don't stay low, these squat guys are going to blast you right out of the ring, unquote. Thus, Akebono needed, according to Beveridge, to strengthen his legs and his glutes to give himself a firm foundation, and to work on his flexibility, especially in his legs, to get as low to the ground as possible. If he could do that, Beveridge said, he'd be nigh unbeatable given his size and reach, quote, even with dynamite, they won't be able to move you. Turned out to be pretty good advice, looking at Akebono's record, because we have arrived at the moment where I give you an overview through at least the first part of his career in the ring, and oh boy, Akebono's was a doozy. By the start of 1989, Akebono had notched 4 winning records, 2 5-2 showings, 2 6-1 ones, and made it all the way to Sandanme 60 East. The next year saw even more winning records, 4 5-2 finishes, 2 6-1 finishes, and a rise all the way to Makushita 3 East, knocking on the door of the Juryo division and the paid 15-match-a-tournament Sekitori ranks. The New Year's tournament of 1990 was just okay, 4 wins, 3 losses, but that's still a winning record and enough to get Akebono into Juryo. And 3 more winning records in what are now a 15-match tournament, 1 8-7 showing, 2 11-4 ones, got him all the way through the ranks of the second highest division in sumo. By September 1990, about 2.25 years since he'd debuted in sumo, Akebono was Maegashira 14 East. He'd made it all the way to the top division of sumo. That is a pretty meteoric rise up the ranks. For comparison, remember, Taiho made his debut in September 1956 and didn't make the top division until 1960. It took him 3 years. Now, Akebono's rise to the top division isn't the fastest in sumo history. If you're wondering, the record so far as I know is making the top division after 9 tournaments, including your Maizumo debut, held jointly by Jokoryu, a wrestler who debuted in May of 2011 and hit the top division in November of 2012, Takeru Fuji, debut in November 2022, top division in March of 2024, and Konishiki, who debuted in November 2023 and just hit the top division in the last tournament as of me writing this, March of 2025. This episode is going to come out after the May tournament's already started, but as of the time I'm writing and recording this, they've just released the Bansuke for the next tournament, and he's been bumped from Maegashira 15 East to Maegashira 9 East after going 11-4 in his first top division showing. Definitely a guy to watch, and interestingly enough, also not Japanese. He's Ukrainian, and we'll talk more about that in a future episode. Prior to Akebono, Konishiki himself had been the previous record holder. I think, I might be wrong about this one, who managed top division promotion in exactly 2 years. What I'm getting at here is that Akebono was clearly good. Anyone watching at the time could have seen that. He wasn't necessarily obviously one of the best of his generation, just clearly up in the top. At any rate, his rise was happening in 1990 and 1991, more or less the height of Konishiki's best statistical streak as an Ozeki, his best chance for promotion to yokozuna, where, excepting one tournament he missed because of injuries, his worst record was 9-6. So most of the press attention directed towards Azumaseki Bea was not on this up-and-coming kid, it was on the existing established Ozeki. There was also the factor of the Hanada brothers, Wakanohana and especially Takanohana, who were climbing the Bansuke alongside Akebono at more or less the same pace, but who were, of course, thanks to their parentage, a lot more famous. Which, of course, just pissed off Akebono even more. They were getting much more attention despite the fact that he had a winning record against both of them, and that really lit a fire under Akebono. In his first 4 top division tournaments, September 1990 to March 1991, Akebono picked up a winning record every time, as well as 3 of the special prizes, 2 Shukunsho, or Outstanding Performance Awards, and 1 Kantosho, or Fighting Spirit Awards, as well as his first Kinboshi, for putting the yokozuna Asai Fuji onto the clay. All of which was very impressive, but his rival Takanohana, whose own father had actually, way back in the day, lost to a then up-and-coming Chiyono Fuji and realized his own career was ending, well, Takanohana was in turn the one who beat Chiyono Fuji on his way up the Bansuke, leading to the great yokozuna realizing it was time to hang things up. Akebono would never forgive him for that, and would still almost a decade later complain that he'd never had a chance to take on the great lone wolf himself, and prove that he could also take Chiyono Fuji. And it's true that mostly Akebono at this point was putting up 8-7 or 9-6 records, winning ones but just barely, but he was taking on tough opponents and he was managing them. And by May of 1991, he'd made it to Sekiwake, the second highest of the 3 Sanyaku champion ranks, the same one his Oyakata Takamiyama had hit his own ceiling at. But then he stalled out. For the next 4 tournaments, Akebono would go 8-7 one and then 7-8 the next, earning a slight promotion, then a demotion, but more or less staying in the same area on the Bansuke. Whenever you see something like this in sumo, the suspicion is a nagging injury of some kind, since after all, sitting out matches for an injury doesn't protect you from demotion, it incentivizes playing hurt to, if not earn a higher rank, at least protect what you have. So far as I know, Akebono never confirmed this, and even today, when conversations around injury are more open than they used to be, it's still something in my experience Rikishi tend to avoid talking about, so we don't know for sure, this is just me speculating. Regardless, by the first tournament of 1992, things had either healed up enough with rest, or something clicked in a big way. In that tournament, Akebono picked up 13 wins to 2 losses, a Junyusho, losing out only to Takanohana, which you know he took personally, and 2 out of the 3 prizes for the tournament, both Shukunsho, Outstanding Performance, and Kantosho, Fighting Spirit. March saw a bit of a slump, 8 wins to 7 losses, enough to protect his rank of Sekiwake, which he'd just returned to after slightly under a year, but nothing spectacular. But then in May he went 13-2 again, losing only to Konishiki and another Sekiwake, Akinoshima, and beating both Wakanohana and Takanohana, and he picked up his first ever Yusho, his top division victory, and a chance to hold the Emperor's Cup. And this matters for a few different reasons. First of all, of course, it was a sign of just how much his training, especially with Dr. Beveridge, was paying off. Second, I imagine that specifically now that he was in the top division, it was pretty vindicating to beat the Hanada brothers and win the tournament on top of that. But third and most importantly, those of you doing the math will recognize that 13, 8, and 13 adds up to 34. One more than the magic number 33 wins in 3 tournaments, necessary for a Sekiwake to earn the promotion to the rank of Ozeki, the highest of the Sanyaku champion ranks and the penultimate spot on the Bansuke. Of course, Ozeki is also where that nebulous character requirement starts to rear its head, but Akebono had done something that by this point not even Konishiki had fully managed. He'd really managed to publicly learn how to act the character of the ideal Rikishi. If you read Mark Panik's biography of Akebono, and if you enjoy sumo, I highly recommend it. There are things I'd do differently if I wrote it, but I think it's a fascinating look into the history of the sport. You'll see all these little moments along the way that are familiar to any foreigner who's lived a long time in Japan. For example, Akebono talked a lot about resenting his stablemates for teasing him initially, but then visiting the home of one of his fellow Rikishi, meeting his family, and realizing that in a society where open displays of affection are kind of taboo, that was how people tended to demonstrate care. Akebono talked about learning to appreciate Takamiyama's demands for gaman, for endurance, even if he never quite forgave his Oyakata for doubting him early on, because after all, you do need endurance most in sumo. The training regime, the tournaments, and especially at the upper levels, the public persona you have to keep up are a grind, and you have to have some mental fortitude to manage it. Even the stoic requirements of sumo-do, the way of sumo, the expectations of stoic gravitas for top division wrestlers, those started to make sense. Chiyonofuji had embodied them on such a fundamental level, and Akebono had been so impressed by what he saw in that. He talked a lot later in his life about coming to understand from Chiyonofuji that the expectations of sumo are what separate a great Rikishi, and especially a yokozuna, from, say, a star quarterback in the NFL or a huge NBA personality like Michael Jordan, what puts sumo fundamentally in its own category. So for example, when he won his first tournament in the top division in May 1992, Akebono had to do the usual raft of TV interviews, and he hit them with exactly the right note. When asked how he'd managed to win, he didn't talk about how he was just that good or brag about his accomplishments. His answer was just, "Ganbarimashita, I tried my best," the classic sumo interview response in a nutshell. I would also be remiss not to note that in rising to Ozeki in exactly 4 years of tournaments, from March 1988 to March 1992, that's pretty meteoric. That was, at the time, the fastest promotion to Ozeki in history. That record has since been smashed by current Ozeki, and if he wins this May tournament that's about to start, almost certainly guaranteed future Yokozuna, Onosato Daiki, who incredibly made it all the way from his debut to Ozeki in 9 professional tournaments. But that's with a bit of an asterisk. There's been a rule change now that lets college sumo champions, which he was at Nippon Sports University, I think, start much higher on the Bansuke than they otherwise would. He debuted at Makushita 10, a rank that took Akebono a year and a half just to get to. Anyway, Akebono is now an Ozeki, and coincidentally right around this time it was also announced that the only active Yokozuna of the time, Hokutoumi, was about to retire. Given that there were now no Yokozuna, and that Akebono was now an Ozeki and Konishiki was already one, this meant that for the next tournament, for the first time ever, the top 2 names on the Bansuke would belong to foreigners. That's the first time, wouldn't be the last. Indeed, right around this time, another great Hawaiian wrestler who would one day be a Yokozuna was arriving in Japan, Fiamalu Pentiani, who went to Musashigawa Stable and became known as Musashi Maru. And I mention Musashi Maru both because he'll be relevant in a little bit, and because I want to note that Akebono and Konishiki had become this vanguard of an increased foreign presence in sumo. Mark Panic will also interview Musashi Maru, and their answers collectively about how the three of them started to fit into sumo culture in Japan, I think are really interesting. You see, I very often see both Japanese and non-Japanese people talk about sumo and more broadly Japanese culture in these very essentialist terms. And if you don't know what I mean by that, essentialism is this notion that there's some kind of objective essence to a person or culture that is distinct or identifiable. So an essentialist read on sumo might be that it is an expression of some kind of pure Japanese spirit that is distinct and wrapped up in real Japaneseness and thus inaccessible beyond a certain point to anyone who's not really Japanese. I hate this kind of rhetoric, both in terms of Japan specifically and also literally any culture, including my own. For Japan specifically, it's often packaged alongside language of foreigners being too individualistic, but of course, collectivism is not something that was invented in Japan, and over the course of this show, we've looked at a great many people in Japanese history who were very individualistic. Were they not really Japanese? The whole thing strikes me as this lazy exercise in cultural stereotyping, and that's why I love Akebono and especially Musashi Maru's answers to Panic's questions about fitting into sumo culture. When asked about the expectations placed on him as a higher-level rikishi, this was Akebono's response, quote, "You can't pay attention to that kind of stuff because when you start thinking about stuff like that, you start getting scared. To me, I feel that when you mess up is when you start to think. If you say what you feel and say it in a nice way, you should be alright." In other words, there's not some secret code you have to learn but you can't really because you don't really belong. To be honest, just don't be a jerk and do your best. People respond to that. Musashi Maru, who was still an ozeki when Panic interviewed him, but would again eventually become a yokozuna, said similarly that, quote, "I'm just the same old guy," unquote, as he was when he arrived in Japan. He said he never really had to assimilate to Japaneseness and told a story about Jesse Oyakata, that's Takamiyama, who was not his stable master, but took an interest in Musashi Maru as a fellow Hawaiian, and who told the rikishi, quote, "Even though you don't know how to speak the language, just bow. Even if you don't know them, just bow. That's about it. But me, Musashi Maru," saying this about himself, "hard-headed, I see somebody, no bowing for me." Underneath this quote, Panic then adds, quote, "Musashi Maru fit in, not despite his failure to give much thought to even the most universally accepted of Japanese customs, but because of it, and because of the affable way he went about doing it. Dealing with culture situationally, based on individual encounters, he thought of the Japanese as people, rather than business card-producing karaoke enthusiasts who bathe en masse and bow at each other all day. And they in turn came to think of him not in gaijin Japanese terms, but affectionately, as Maru-chan." This really tracks with my personal experiences in Japan where, shockingly, I tend to stick out like a sore thumb. But I've always found people responded well, even when I was younger and my Japanese was a lot worse, or more recently when my Japanese has gotten a lot worse due to lack of practice, to simple goodwill, trying your best, being game to try things. This sort of essentialist nonsense about some unbridgeable divide in our human experiences based on where we're from always struck me as stupid, and hearing Akebono and Musashi Maru say much the same thing was very vindicating. Anyway, back to the progression of Akebono's career. It's July 1992 and Akebono has earned his promotion to ozeki at long last, matching Konishiki in rank, the world his oyster. He's already surpassed Takanohana, who's still a komusubi at this point, and Wakanohana, who's Maegashira 1 East. Of course, he then immediately had to sit out the next tournament due to a nagging injury, missing all 15 days. And that's a precarious spot to be in. An ozeki with a losing record, and that includes days missed for injuries as losses, is what's called kadoban ozeki, at the bottom of the board. If they have a second losing record, they're demoted. They lose ozeki status. So September had to go well. And it did, but not great. A final result of 9-6, which is enough to clear kadoban status, but not a dominant showing. Made even worse by the fact that Takanohana rolled that tournament, going 14-1 and grabbing the Yusho. But then Akebono came roaring back. In the last tournament of 1992, he managed his own 14-1 showing, including beating both of the Hanada brothers. Nobody came close. The next highest record for that Bansuke was the Komusubi, Konishiki, with 13-2, but since Akebono had beaten him on day 5, it was clear the Ozeki was the one who had the momentum behind him. This was also Akebono's second top division win, his first as an Ozeki, and it opened up an important window. After all of the kerfuffles around Konishiki not becoming a yokozuna, the Japan Sumo Association had been forced to issue a clarification of its general guidelines for yokozuna promotion. What they said was that beyond all the usual stuff about character, comportment, dignity, you needed 2 back-to-back Yusho, championships as an Ozeki, or the equivalent accomplishment. Which meant if Akebono could do it again in January, he'd have the requirements. Promotion wasn't automatic, the council still had to decide to give it to him, but he'd have made his case for, as they say, getting the rope. In the New Year's tournament of 1993, held at the Kokugikan in Tokyo, things were electric. Everyone knew the story going in, and Akebono did not disappoint. The very first week, Akebono went undefeated, looking for all the world like yokozuna material. And to make things even more exciting, so did Takanohana. Meanwhile, the rest of the top end of the Bansuke was looking a bit rough. Both Wakanohana and Konishiki dropped several early matches. It was already looking like the championship was going to come down to Akebono versus Takanohana for the Yusho. And in the end, that's exactly what happened. The second week added a little more drama. Takanohana dropped a match on day 7, but then Akebono lost on day 8 to Wakanohana, no less, though how Wakanohana felt about helping his brother out by this point, we don't exactly know. The Maegashira 14, Dai Shoyama, even came out of nowhere to take the lead for a bit before dropping a couple matches on day 12 and 13 to Wakanohana and Musashimaru, one Hawaiian helping out another. And in the end, when matches were announced for the last day, it was exactly what everyone expected. Akebono, current record 12-2, against Takanohana, current record 12-2. The winner would take the Yusho, the championship, and if Akebono could do it, he'd have met the qualifications for a yokozuna spot. The match on Senshuraku, the last day of the tournament, which by the way is also the term used for the last part of a kabuki performance, and let me tell you, I've seen a lot of hay made of that linguistic parallel. It was almost incredible for how anticlimactic it was. I don't know how to describe this match except that Akebono just locked in and smoked Takanohana. He opened with a beautiful thrust to the throat that carried Takanohana straight back, and then from there, things were basically already over. His opponent just couldn't recover his balance before Akebono was on him to force him out. The NHK commentator for the match called it Migoto no sumo, beautiful performance, roughly translating, and it's hard to disagree. Akebono had gotten his second consecutive Yusho, his third in the top division. Everyone knew what that meant, and the discourse in the sumo world was all over the place. Was this foreigner about to defile the sport's top rank without really understanding what it meant? But had Akebono really proven that he understood the way of sumo? What did it mean if a foreigner became yokozuna? Mark Panic points out that if you watch the match after Akebono beats Takanohana, there's this moment of triumph you can see flash across Akebono's face, and why not? Takanohana had been one of Akebono's biggest rivals, someone who'd been treated as just fundamentally better than him by virtue of parentage and sumo pedigree. How could it not feel good to take him down, especially in that context? The American thing to do here would be to celebrate, raise one's fists, shout in triumph, spike the football. But Akebono did what a rikishi is supposed to do. Calmly reach down, help Takanohana up without even a smile, then walk back over to his starting spot and bow calmly. He played his part. And as he put it later to Panic, he knew that jumping up and down to celebrate was what he wanted to do, but what he was not supposed to do. Quote, "I guess after all the years you learn, I did my jumping when nobody was watching. Just me and my boys and the people who count." Similarly, when asked about yokozuna promotion by the press during his interviews afterwards, Akebono did not bring up that after the whole Konishiki fiasco, The yokozuna deliberation council had been kind of backed into a corner here with its clearer standard. He didn't say anything about having earned it or feeling he deserved it. He just said, all I can do is work hard on the dohyo. What happens after that is up to other people. That's what a good rikishi says. And so whatever their misgivings, ultimately the yokozuna deliberation council decided Akebono had proven himself. A few days later, the announcement came. Akebono had gotten one more promotion, the last of his career. He would be the 64th yokozuna, and the first non-Japanese citizen ever to hold the title. What did that mean? We'll find out next week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com. You can also support the show on Patreon. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for part 6.